So let's see, it's time to open up to questions. I'm gonna invite the presenters as you respond to questions. I think I've peppered you with some questions as well. So if any of those answers happen to fit well into the participants' questions, please feel free to offer those. But I'd like to prioritize the time for the participants. So let's go ahead and get started. I saw a hand up in the very back, and then the second right here.
Sure. Questions for Bob. I think the value of your research is tremendous, not just for community banks, but for regulators. A lot of us feel the Basel III requirements and the capital ratios required for banks and the stress testing that we have to go through is significantly onerous. And what the kind of research you're doing can do to help us in the future is critical. But my question is relative to the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. The federal regulatory bodies are tasked with coming up with creating a community bank leverage ratio, capital ratio, which will probably fall somewhere between 8 and 10%, that really will simplify and make accessible an optional resource for us to focus our capital on a target rather than all of the other capital measures that we have to apply for. And I think that if your research could test both pre-08 and post those community banks at those ratios and help the regulatory bodies create a community bank leverage ratio, there's 90% of the banks in Pennsylvania who, if it was an 8% ratio, they would be able to take advantage of that, reduce their regulatory burdens and costs around managing all of the different capital requirements that they have to report on a quarterly and monthly basis. And so my question really is can your research evolve and help regulators work on this critical issue to community banking and our future?
Okay, so thank you for that. That's a big question. First of all, I'll take it as a very positive comment on what we're doing, and that's nice to know. Second of all, I mean, it's a big paper, and we're not done writing the paper. In 15 minutes, I can't present everything. We certainly did stress test the banks with their leverage ratios as well, and the leverage. The leverage ratios continue to hold up better than the risk-based capital ratios hold up, which is the point here. So if you're asking me my opinion on this, I think it makes perfect sense for this kind of regulation. We can certainly stress that more in the paper, and then go to the 8% level or whatever the regulators decide to propose. And I think that would be a nice way to use the model. I appreciate that comment, and it actually makes what we're doing a little more relevant. Thanks, not just to community bankers, and quickly to Beth's comments, Beth said as well that regulators and researchers might be interested in this. And the original idea was to do plug and play. That was the original idea. And Joe, in fact, has already programmed a scenario generator. However, as we go through this, we realize any plug and play animal that you put up there has to be bulletproof. Because the last thing you want is someone saying, well, I put in this unemployment rate and this and my data, and the thing blew up. It gave me a stupid answer, but that's where we're aiming at. I appreciate your insight. You're on the same wavelength as we are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and the second question here.
Hi, Tim Yeager from University of Arkansas, and I have a comment for Thomas, and then a couple comments for Bob as well. First of all, I moved back to St. Louis in 1998, and the housing market was hot. My wife and I had never owned a home before, and we took the plunge and bought a house, and we used Carrollton Bank as and it turns out that so we walk out of there a little bit white-faced because we're 100,000 plus more in debt than we've ever been in our lives, and yet your bank gave us an apple pie as a gift for closing, and I remembered that forever. And every time I teach my banking classes and we talk about how community banks can be different and have great service, I bring up the example that I got an apple pie when my bank closed my loan. And so I think that's And then secondly, just a couple comments for Bob. I appreciate the research, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday. A couple of points. I think it could use a little more justification for the 500 million size split. So why 500 million up to 10 billion and then below 500 million? Secondly, to know the number of banks in the samples for the different scenarios that you run would be helpful. And let's think. And then third, if you could run an in-sample stress test in the year 2000 using, let's say, quarter 4 2007, right? And then do an in-sample test to see, well, how did the banks that were actually there in 2007 go through this scenario analysis? I think that would be really helpful as well. And then finally, just a shameful plug for my own product here. 3 years ago, actually, I did present at the same conference a community bank stress test. It is not published, but close. And I finally got around to updating this thing. It also is available on my website, and I'm happy to give people information about that. And it's done through Microsoft Excel, and it's plug and play in the sense that you don't even have to talk to me to get the data. And so you can just go to the website, and there's a user manual and the Excel spreadsheet. And we do update it at the year end. So it gets updated about March of every year once the fourth quarter data are released. And it has, I think it's a simpler model than what you propose. And there's some advantages to that. A disadvantage is that you can't do explicit scenario analyses. And so I think that that's a real added value to your approach.
Well, thanks, Tim. I look forward to getting your paper, and in fact, I can get it now. I'll just go to your website and find it. But it's nothing what you just said is self-serving at all, so don't worry about that. I think the more work we do this, and it's good. This conference is interesting because we're all told when we present research to we're talking to smart people, but we can't talk like economists. We have to try to speak normal English, and more models like yours, and hopefully ours at the end, that community banks can access. Then I think that's great.
Thank you. To make sure, let's see, I've got one question here and then one further back.
I have a question for Mike. I'm just wondering how you control for the timing of the CEO succession relative to the exogenous timing of the bank's exam cycle.
Sure. So through the exam reports that we have, we know exactly how many quarters before the CEO session the exam took place that it has the original rating. And then we know exactly how many quarters after the CEO session, because we have the date of the session that the event or the change in the rating took place. So we're controlling that with a variable and testing the significance of that variable in the regression.
But if the succession occurs like right after they had an exam, then there's going to be a long lag before there's any change, right?
That's correct.
So, but somehow you're building that in so you're not treating differently the bank that has succession right after exam versus one that had one 11 months after exam.
Right. So it's essentially how much time has the CEO had to impact the improvement of their management staff that's reflected then in the rating, and we're controlling for that. Yeah. So I might also just answer one of your questions is about how fast training happens and training at these organizations. I think of two things. And Bob and I were talking just briefly. Many of these rural banks may be making successions within families, right? Yeah. And so we don't have a way other than last name in the data set for controlling for that. But it would be interesting to try to figure out how many family successions there are, like Tom's. And that would mean sort of many decades of training for that incoming CEO in most cases. Yeah. And the other thing is the technology has taken away the distance for learning, right? And so perhaps in the past, some in a rural community couldn't have access to online learning like they do today, which may be sort of mitigating some of the benefit that urban banks had in the past.
Thanks. So there, I saw a hand. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Kia Haslett, I'm with S&P Global, so I was very excited to hear so many recommendations about the product today. But I wanted to ask Bob a question. what do you think the stress test model tells us about the capital adequacy for community banks going into CECL?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Into CECL, the current expected credit loss model that will require banks to reserve for all loan losses at origination.
Oh, I don't think anything. I mean, short answer, I'll have to think about it, but off the top of my head, I don't think we're going to learn much from our model about that.
So one of my concerns is, or I've heard it discussed that banks are concerned that the one-time hit, reserving for the allowance, will destroy capital and potentially create thinner capital levels at banks, and that also it might be too hard to forecast. And your model has both a 9-quarter forecast and shows capital resiliency across the industry. So I've always struggled to reconcile the stress testing results at the large banks, as well as their feedback to regulators that CECL is too onerous.
Yeah, your model is based on historic data, so the combination of provisioning and charging off, that's all based on historic data, and so we wouldn't have any variation based on the change to the CECL. So I don't think we could. We're not modeling that, and I just don't think we get there. Yeah, call back in 10 years, we'll have it.
So we're up. So thanks to everyone. I see there are more questions, and I would encourage all of us to continue the conversation over lunch. I believe Julie has a couple of items to share. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone on the panel. Yeah, these Carrollton Bank pies are well known among my examination staff. I have all these people now that are recruited from looking at your holding company because they have mortgages through Carrollton Bank. And then we get into this ethics issue of can they take a pie or not. It's very hard being a regulator. But for those of you that have now heard about it, I don't know, maybe pies will be the next thing, Tom. We'll wait and see.